Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Naomi, and I am pursuing my master's in data science and business analytics from the School of Data Science. I would like to welcome you all to the sixth annual Charlotte Women in Data Science virtual conference hosted and sponsored by UNC Charlotte School of Data Science and Lowe's Inc. The With Charlotte Conference initiative aims to inspire and educate data scientists across the region, regardless of gender, and to support women in the field. With the current state of the world mainly interacting online, we are grateful for your decision to attend our 2 day virtual event and show your support for our various speakers. I'd like to extend a special thanks to all of our attendees for showing up and showing your support. I am happy to introduce our speaker for the hour, Kathleen Maley, Senior Vice President, Analytics Executive at Strategic Analytics and Data Monetization. Let's give our virtual round of applause and welcome Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Can you hear me and can you see me? Looks like my video just popped up. Excellent. So I just want to say how happy I am to be here, how desperate I wish we were in person. Charlotte was my home for a long, long time. I've seen some familiar names popping up into the participant window. And so I can't wait to jump into the content, and I can't wait until next year when I'm hoping we can all be together in person. So Naomi, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let's jump into it. Analytics in the wild. My assumption is that many of the people in this talk today are either still students, perhaps a bit earlier in your career. And what I know from my own personal experience is transitioning from the classroom to the workplace is not always seamless. That what we actually have to do once we get into the workplace is put all of those skills that we've learned to use. It's like giving a writer a pen. Having a pen doesn't make you a writer. Having ideas, having command of the language, and being able to communicate ideas through words, that's what makes you a writer. That's what we're going to talk about today. So being a great analyst isn't just about having the data science skills. It is absolutely necessary, but it is not sufficient. So today I'm going to cover a few things, some soft skills, not everything that is required, but one of the most important things I discovered through my own development as an analyst. Talk a little bit about components of a successful partner engagement, because that's really the journey upon which you're embarking. How do you become a thought partner? How do you become a teammate for these business people who are trying to solve these problems? And then I'm going to touch on data literacy and what I think of when I say data literacy and why it's so important if we want the work that we're doing to actually make a difference in the workplace. So the first thing that you've got to know and be ready for and expect, and something you might be familiar with, is that most questions come in the form of a data request. And it's probably going to look something like, hey, Kathleen, can you get me the data that shows that client experience increased because of this preferred call center gate that I created? And my favorite, it should be really easy. I just need the data. This is the reality of how most analytics requests come to us. And I'll say a little bit more about this later, but it's, when we're dealing with our business partners, we're actually the experts in what analytics can do for them. They're not. They're the expert in the problem they're trying to solve. And so every request comes in the form of data. That's okay. When I first started my career, started working as an analyst, and I think I saw Doug Haig's name. Doug is an old boss of mine. And so he probably remembers this. The conversation I would have with a business leader who came to me and said, hey, Kathleen, can you get me this data? Was all about the data. Sure, what data do you need? Over what time period? How do you need it cut? Do you need it trended? And then I would say, okay, great, here's your data. And they would say, super. In this particular example, though, I'm gonna back up a little bit. Had I done that in this case, if I had just handed this business leader the data he had requested, we actually collectively would have made not a very good decision. And the reason I know now that it would not have been a very good decision is because this is not how, in this case, I went through this process. This was the experience, a transformative experience that turned me into the analyst I am today. Now, I still had a lot of learning to do along the way, but this was the beginning for me. This was the example that gave me what I needed to flip my approach from a service-oriented dialogue about the data and handing that data over to a business leader to something very different. And so that is what I want to talk you through. What happened that was different? So it starts with this question, same question. In this case, this business leader happened to ask the question in a slightly different way. And he inadvertently gave me some information that made me very curious. He said, I've done this thing, and I did it to increase client experience. I mean, that's really what I could read between the lines in that question. So it wasn't as simple as, hey, can you get me the data on CX that covers this time period, right? That's zero information. But he said there was something about the preferred call center that he created and that he expected client experience to increase as a result of it. And this gave me the curiosity to ask, well, what did you do? And why did you do it? And what did you think would happen? And how long did it take? And a whole lot more context about what he was really trying to do and why it actually mattered to him. Because of that, I did not approach this problem as getting the data and creating a graph. In this case, it would have been a graph of client experience scores for clients who went to the BAU, the business as usual call center, and clients who went to the call center that was designed to give a higher level of service, right? And so you can picture that graph, right? That it's sort of this flat line over time. If you went to the regular contact center gate, it's just a flat line. Your scores, you were as happy after this new gate was created as you were before. But if you went to the special gate, if you went to this new gate, then you could see your scores increasing over time. The clients were happier with this. That would have been the answer I would have given him, and he would have said, great, I'll spend another $7 million. But instead, I was able to actually dig into this and do the analysis and discover what had impacted that change. Where was that change really coming from? And what was amazing about this experience to me is that, it was difficult. It was absolutely an investigation. And what I discovered through that process was that the $7 million he spent actually wasn't what was affecting the change. What was affecting the change is how he selected the talent with which he staffed this new call center. And because of that, the answer was not, let's spend another $7 million. The answer was, great, let's expand the preferred call center gate with the right people. And so this example not only demonstrates that we were much more responsible and efficient with the company's money. So instead of spending another $7 million, we didn't need to spend those $7 million. We knew what the root cause of the improvement was, and we were able to then focus on that real root cause. And guess what? There's another analytics question that comes out of this. Okay, if we are trying to identify the right people, how do we know who the right people are? How do we know who's almost ready to go to this new call center with the higher level of performance? It was a completely different outcome. And this was the moment when I understood that my job was not about getting the data. My job was about studying the data and helping the business partner answer a really important question and solve a really important problem. Now, actually doing this and having this conversation isn't always easy, because if our partner asks for data, we can't say yes, but we also can't say no. And so naturally the question is, well, what do I say? When my partner comes to me and says, hey, Kathleen, can you get me this data? What do I say? And I, through sometimes painful trial and error, have figured out a phrase that I think is magic. Help me understand what you're trying to achieve so I can better meet your needs. And the reason this phrase is so magical is because in the beginning, when I was trying to gather that context that I need to actually answer the question, was often viewed as a challenge. Why? Why do you need this data? What are you trying to do? What is this decision worth? And all of those felt a little bit, would put that partner on the defense a little bit, like, hey, I know my business. I know what I'm trying to do. Just give me the data. And of course, my intention with those questions was, if I understand what you're trying to solve, I can get you what you really need, and I can get it to you more quickly than if I'm just delivering data, not really knowing where you're headed with it, what you're trying to do with it, if it's going to answer your question, how that data needs to be studied. And so I stumbled across this phrase, which perfectly communicates my intention. Help me understand what you're trying to achieve so I can better meet your needs. Magical phrase, magical phrase. The most important phrase still in my vocabulary. But this is an invitation to a conversation. And so then I have to actually continue with this conversation. And so in gathering context, some of my favorite questions to start the conversation. What is your hypothesis? What is your concern? There's a list of here. I'm sure all of you could add to more, but the trick is to just get the conversation started. Now, in reality, I have had business leaders say, this is really, really important. I don't have time to talk to you. I just need you to get me the data. That can be a little bit trickier. Over the years, I've gotten to a place where I can say, look, if it's really that important, you have time to spend 15 minutes with me to make sure I get you what you need the first time, because otherwise we're going to be going back and forth. And usually that's enough, right? There are fire drills. People have to deal with fire drills. It happens. By and large, if you say, help me understand so I can better meet your needs, you're going to get a very warm reception. So when you are making that transition from providing the data to answering the question, this is going to be a very powerful tool in your toolkit. Okay. So gathering the context is a great start. This is sort of step 2. This is the second stage in that analysis process of actually getting to a good answer. Gathering context is a great start. So I'll share another example with you. This actually was a few years ago when the government shut down. Head of the consumer bank called me and said, hey, Kathleen, what's going to be the impact of the government shutdown? I had a quick conversation with him to understand what was happening. Some of this I already knew. It was obviously in the news. We've been talking about it, but just affirmed, some of what he was looking for, some of what he was thinking about, what sorts of solutions they were starting to think through, what they could do. So I gathered all the context. And I talked to somebody on my team, one of the analysts who worked for me, and said, here's what we need to do. Here's what we're looking for. And he said, okay, great. He went off, he did the work, he gave me 50 pages full of information. I mean, it was all the information I could ever want. He did it in 24 hours. It was amazing. And I said, great. So what's the answer? And he had no idea. He didn't know. So gathering context is a great start, but it isn't sufficient. That isn't what gets us the answer. That's what gets us the start of being able to do our investigation. I often think of our job as that of a private investigator. Now, the process of getting the data is pretty straightforward. And we don't normally think of this process built out in this way, but in practice, this is what's happening. We field that request, we pull the data, we summarize the data, we put it into a 50-page PowerPoint, and we present the data. And we have a half an hour of just reviewing the data, reviewing charts, reviewing all sorts of things. And at the end of it, invariably, one of two things will happen. Either the leader will say, great, but what does it mean? Or more likely, the leader will say, great, but what about this data? Or what about that data? Or what if it's cut this way? Or what if it's cut that way? And it becomes more data work. And that's because we don't really know where we're headed. We haven't really given them the answer. So when I think about what it takes to actually answer a question, it looks a little bit different. Still, we field that request, we define the question. But that pulling of the data and that summarizing of the data, that's actually for me. I summarize the data for myself because that's the data I'm going to study. And analysis is study. Analysis is an active process. Analysis isn't pulling the data and summarizing the data and sharing it out. Analysis is the study of that data and following the leads. So back to my first example, right? When this leader said, hey, I spent this $7 million, show me that client experience went up for the gate that had this special support, the special service. It's what it looked like, but somehow I didn't believe it. And I just kept digging into that data and I turned it on its head. And all of a sudden, when I literally did a transformation of my data and started looking at it in a different way, I got a different answer, and I knew, that is my answer. I have a conclusion. I know what's going on. I can now answer this question. That analysis piece is really hard. That's where our brains get tired. You know, pulling the data, it takes time and it's tricky because data's a mess. But it's that analysis piece where our brains get tired, where we're really connecting the dots and trying to figure out what's going on. But once we figured it out, now we're ready to answer the question. So that summarizing of the data, that 50-page PowerPoint, that's for me as the analyst to study. If I've answered the question, I can take that answer back to a leader in a single page. In the case of that government shutdown, it was just a quick email, literally 4 bullet points. That was it. And I knew I had been successful because the leader said, "Great, Kathleen, thank you." And then said immediately to his team in that email, "What are we going to do about it?" I know I've been successful when the business leader says thanks and then turns to his team and says, "What action are we going to take?" If the leader says to me, "Okay, but I need this data, I need this data, I need this data," I have not answered the question. I've not gotten him what he needs. And so that for me is a really important measure of success. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about analytics not being about the data. It's about solving a business problem. And this is my definition of analytics. It is the discovery, interpretation, and communication of meaningful patterns in data. It is the connective tissue between the data and the effective decision making. Pulling and summarizing data is the beginning. It's the input to an analysis. It is not the analysis itself. Studying that data within a very, very specific context, that is the analysis. And from that, I can help my business leaders make better decisions, monetize on opportunities, manage risk, all sorts of things. But most organizations still are not really familiar with this definition of analytics. So this is an interesting challenge for each of you because you're going to be walking into an organization that may not define analytics that way. You may be in an organization where business partners still haven't been exposed to the data literacy that they need to appreciate how analytics can fit as a tool in their business management process. And so to successfully redefine analytics, it isn't just saying, "Look, I'm not going to give you data anymore. Help me understand what you're really trying to achieve." That's a start. And that is a grassroots movement that everybody who's going into the job, going into the field, and wants to have a career in this field can and should be doing. But for wholesale change, there's a lot else going on here. So I think about the analytics engagement model having several different components. We talked about a few in part today. What is that new definition of analytics? It's not about getting the data. It's about answering a business question. We talked a little bit about how you do that consultative mindset, focusing on the business problem and having a conversation about the business problem before you turn to the data that you will use to help you answer it and solve it. And then the business-minded and outcome-oriented. What difference is this really going to make for the business? And what are the pieces of information they really need? There are additional elements, additional components. Does the business agree actually in this conversion from a data delivery system and service-minded organization to a partner organization where we as analysts are really helping them solve their problems? Who's going to prioritize the work that gets done and who owns those decisions? Dedicated and continuous support. If understanding the business and the business problem is that important, maybe analytics resources can't be fully fungible. Maybe they need to be somehow more directly tied to the business leaders they support. How does that business leader know who to go to when? Who is that person's point of contact so that they can actually build a partnership, build a relationship with their analytics partner so that when a new need comes up, they absolutely know who to call and they know what to expect. That person's going to say, "Great, what are we working on? What are we trying to solve?" And then making that conversation expected and smooth. Portfolio management, business leaders are never going to think, okay, what are all of the requests I've made recently? It really falls on us, those who catch these requests, to keep track of what's happening, where it's happening, when it's happening, how it's happening, when it comes to the analytics portfolio of work. And finally, some more tactical things. What are the operating rhythms? How often am I going to meet with my business partner? What's the point of that meeting? What are my responsibilities in that meeting? What are his responsibilities or her responsibilities in that meeting? And then at a certain level, also, how do we even fund this organization? So I'm laying out this bigger picture because I think it's important to appreciate, as you are operating either in your organizations today or as you are joining analytics teams, what is your role today versus, what is it that you would want for this organization, that you would hope for this organization? How are you going to assess the maturity of the organization that you're in and what you can do to help mature it? But also, as each of you grows in your own career and you move into senior positions, leadership positions, and now your job isn't just doing the analysis, but making sure your team is effective. These are some of the other considerations for you to have in mind as you go through. Underlying all of this is this concept of data literacy. And I think, again, for many, many years as an analytics leader, I was very internally focused on my own team. Did the analysts who work for me have that consultative mindset? Did they understand why focusing on business outcome is so important? Did I make sure that I was setting them up for success with their business partners? It was all very inwardly focused. How were we as an analytics organization operating and engaging with our partners? It's really only been in the last several years that it's dawned on me, we as analytics leaders have not given the same exposure and transparency to the business leaders who depend on us. And so I would bet that in many cases, if you talk to the business leaders who depend on you, and you ask them, how does analytics work? They're not going to be able to answer. If you ask them, how are projects prioritized? They're not going to be able to answer. And I know this because when I walked into my last company, I had analysts who felt completely overwhelmed, just buried in work. And when I talked to the business leaders who supported them, they said, yeah, we don't even know what your team is working on. And it was such a disconnect. And I realized, I owe as much to these business partners that I want pulling on our expertise as I do to my own team in helping set them up for success. If business leaders don't know how to work with us, then still this engagement model is going to have friction in it. And so I think about data literacy not in terms of turning them into data scientists. I don't care if they know what Python is. I don't care if they understand the fundamentals of machine learning. What I really care about is, here's sort of the big picture of what analytics is and what we're going to try and do for you. Here's how we have found it works best. These are the routines that we need to put in place. Here's why we need to put these routines into place. Does that make sense for you? What's working for you? What's not working for you? And really bringing them into the process. I used to think I shouldn't do that. That's really mine to solve. They should spend their time worried about the business problems they're trying to solve. And what I've come to understand is, as long as analytics is a black box to them, we will continue to be held at arm's length. It's a really uncomfortable position to put them in, and it puts them at a disadvantage in terms of their ability to engage with us. And so data literacy, I think, is becoming more and more important, although my definition of it is perhaps slightly different than many you'll come across. And so the last thought I want to leave you with is just a quote by Julia Child. And some of you might know this show. My kids love it, nailed it. No one is born a great cook, one learns by doing. And so all of this stuff we've talked about today, it takes practice to get good at it. It takes time for it to become second nature. And what I can promise you is that the first couple times you try to have a different type of conversation with your business partner, it might feel a little bit awkward. It might feel a little bit uncomfortable. It helps to set that up by saying, hey, I want to try a new approach. What do you think about this? And then you practice. You just practice. The more you do it, the easier it gets. It becomes second nature. And as soon as you win with one business partner, now you're going to go, aha, I get it. And you can move on to another and another and really start to expand your reach and expand your impact. So Just go try. I tell my kids all the time, you don't get great at soccer by thinking about soccer. You get great at soccer by going out and first being terrible at soccer and then developing the skills. So, so that's a final thought. I do also want to make an invitation to you. There's another organization called Women in Analytics that many of you are probably familiar with. Women in Analytics has just published its first book. So anybody who's interested in learning more about some of these topics from 45 amazing women, and same concept as the Women in Data Science organization, which I think is so important. It's about highlighting women analysts, but the information is practical and useful for everyone. So feel free to check that out. And so that's it. I'm going to stop talking there. That's just about the 30 minutes. So we have time for some Q&A. So Naomi, you tell me. I think I'll stop sharing my screen. And then you tell me how we'll run the Q&A portion.
Sure. So before I go into the Q&A, I just want to thank Kathleen for this session and helping us to understand how soft skills are important to be a data analyst. So thank you so much, Kathleen. And I don't see any questions right now in the chat screen, but feel free to post in any questions. You can post it to everybody, or you can post it to Kathleen directly, or to me directly, so that I can tell it out.
And maybe one more offer. If anybody wants to connect offline, I'm always happy to do that. That's why I keep my contact information at the bottom of the slide. You know, I always love connecting with new people, and I'm always happy to help share more information or more about my own experience.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Let me turn my camera on. Hi, Kathleen, it's Philip.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing very well.
You look great.
Thank you. Excited to see you. I've worked at large companies and small companies, and I've seen the same kind of gaps when we start specializing between business roles and analytical roles. I wanted to get your perspective on, I guess, what's the larger gap? Is it business literacy in analytical roles, or is it analytical literacy in business roles? And how can we close those kinds of gaps?
Oh my gosh, that's so good. First of all, thank you for acknowledging it's a two-sided problem. It's a two-sided problem, right? So as a leader, I often think, well, where do I have more influence? And I have more influence over the individuals who report directly. So I have often spent more time influencing my own teams and pushing them closer to the business leader. But that gap will not be covered if we don't do a better job of educating and influencing those business leaders to meet analysts where they are. And so I think it's a lot about, I think there's huge value in business leaders who have an analytics background. I think that's hugely valuable because the analytics is about solving the problem. So even if that's not their responsibility in that role, they will naturally be able to engage with their analytics partners better. But I have to say, a lot of analysts are still just, can I get you this data? And their business partner doesn't even know that there's more to it. They think that's what analysts do. They think analysts are just there to get the data. So it's a tough question. Frankly, it depends, right? And part of it depends on the individual. But I think, you know, each side needs to work together, needs to bridge together. I would love to see more programs for business leaders that are focused on how they should interact with analytics experts as opposed to the fundamentals of data science.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Philip.
We do have one more question in the chat. It says, how do you become a data steward?
Oh my gosh, well, data steward, that's a huge question. And I would say it doesn't have an answer. And the reason I know it doesn't have an answer is because if you ask 10 people, you'll get different answers. What do I think of as a data steward? A data steward is somebody who cares for the meaning of the data, right? So it's not an operational job. It is a person who understands what that data is, what that data should be, what it should mean. For example, if I am responsible for a credit card, right? And I know what is a reasonable interest rate and what is not a reasonable interest rate. And I see an element, a field that says this person's interest rate is 99%. I know as the business owner that never in a million years would we have a 99% interest rate on a credit card. It probably should be 9.99%. So I think the data steward is the person who can answer the questions about what the data should be based on business knowledge. But it's not necessarily the person who could fix it operationally if there's a problem. It's not the person who can necessarily track down where an operational break has happened. And so I think part of the challenge, this idea of a data steward, has become more and more important with this notion of good data governance. And so I think there are several different roles, several different tasks, not all of which reside in the same person. And so people are sort of defining data steward in a way that very often in a way that checks the box without really looking at what are the roles and responsibilities associated with this title and what is the skill set of the person who needs to have this title. It may not even be a role, it might be a responsibility that resides within a role. And so I think we need a lot better definition of what does it mean to have good data governance and who is responsible for what, and then decide, is that the data steward? Is that this person? Is that person? I have, in my last company, we had data stewards, but they were sometimes business people, they were sometimes in technology, they were sometimes in the analytics team. And what that tells me is, yes, we had somebody called data steward, but we didn't really know what that person was supposed to do. And we couldn't necessarily guarantee that that person had the skills required to solve whatever problem happened to pop up that day.
Yep, we do have one more question from Ritika. She asks, how can we decide whether data is sensitive?
Oh, well, I mean, I would say regulation number one, follow the law. If the law says this is sensitive data, then it is sensitive data. But I think there's a little bit of common sense in there too. And sometimes there's a little bit of discussion. If it makes me feel ooky, I got to listen to that. If it makes somebody else feel ooky, it's worth having a conversation. So we've got to bring our human intelligence set. Number one is regulation. Number one is absolutely, you got to know your laws, your regulation policy. But the other is this going to make me feel ooky, right? And those are those unintended consequences. And what is that data? How can that data be used safely in one context versus another? I think about the Target example, and some of you may remember this from a few years ago, but Target landed in the news because they were sending congratulatory emails or mailers to women that they suspected were pregnant based on what they were buying. And, these models are actually quite accurate. Unfortunately, these mailers were going to homes of teenage girls who hadn't yet told their parents that they were pregnant. And so, whoops, one might consider that sensitive. You wouldn't necessarily think of it in those terms, but it turned out to be quite sensitive. So there's, I think there's the laws and the regulations first, but then we've got to really start to take data ethics very seriously and think about the unintended consequences of some of these decisions and how the data are being used.
We have a question from Doug. He asks, what would you recommend for a woman who wants to break into data analytic roles? Say they are in a business role, conversely an IT role.
Oh, I think that's a great question. I think if I think about my own experience, obviously it's about being curious. I think also, that having the right educational background, there's just, there's a set of tools and skills that we need as data scientists that that are not necessarily easy to pick up sort of on the fly. And so I think some formal education, but that could be in the form of a master's degree. It could be in the form of a certification program. But if you're in a business role now, get to know the analysts that work with you and start taking these things we've talked about today and putting them into practice with them. Talk to them about what it is you want to learn, see if you can get involved with some projects. I think those are all really good ways. And frankly, I think that's the same for women as it is for men. You know, women still face hurdles. This is still a male-dominated industry. There's no denying that. In fact, I had a job interview that last week that was so strange. I can't even get into it today, but I left that interview thinking, this is the thing he thinks women want to talk about. And in a professional interview, I can tell you, this is not the thing that we want to talk about. So there are still some things that are unique to us. So talking to other women in corporate America, talking to other women in data science functions, I think is it really important, because we can share how do you deal with some of those really strange situations. But in terms of making the switch, you know, a lot of it is the same. I will say, and I hesitate to say this, but I think I will. And I would just ask that you know, you take my words in the spirit with which they're intended. You know, so much of this work, so much of what makes me a good analyst is my ability to engage with business leaders on a very human level, to have empathy, to put myself in their shoes. Women are often, and to be in a support role and really be invested in the success of my partner. And that is a position that very often women are comfortable playing. And I wonder at times if because of that tendency, are women in some cases actually more valuable in a role like this, where, you know, I personally am very comfortable seeing myself in a support function to the business, helping the business be successful. It's not my priorities, it's their priorities. And I think that can be very, very valuable. So I think there are skills that we have that we can double down on. I think we have the skills when it comes to transformation and culture change that organizations would do well to double down on. The hard skills are the same.
Kathleen, is there anything else that you want to share with us?
I don't think so. I just want to say again how much I appreciate being here. Please, anyone who's interested in getting in touch, feel free to contact me through LinkedIn, through email, through text, whatever works for you. And I hope I will get invited back next year, because any excuse to come back to Charlotte.
I do have your LinkedIn. I'm just putting that up in the chat for anybody who would want to reach out to you.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Naomi, and thanks to UNC Charlotte for hosting. This is really a great opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. I do hope you enjoy the rest of the session.